From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Before I arrived in Oregon, I had never heard the word caneberry. Now, what caneberry refers to is a family of berries that grow on hard woody stems that, resemble a cane. And we know some of these. Raspberries are the iconic caneberry, but it also involves things like blackberries, boysenberries, and special here to Oregon, marionberries. And Oregon is really one of the leading producers of caneberries. In fact, I came to know that in 1910, Gresham was known as the raspberry capital of the world. Gresham, just outside of Portland. And we've developed a number of breeds here in Oregon. And so with caneberry bloom just coming up in the next week or two, I thought it'd be a great opportunity to invite back our perennial pollinator expert, Jim Kane. Now, many of you know Dr. Kane. He formerly was at the USDA Logan Bee Lab. He's currently retired, but exceedingly busy working on all sorts of projects. And we had an opportunity to catch up with him and learn more about the pollination of this great crop. Some great recommendations if you're a grower, but also if you're kind of curious about the pollination biology and some of the bees that visit this plant. This episode is for you. So this week, we're going to do caneberries with Dr. Kane on pollination. Here we go. Welcome again. Dr. Kane, I think you're the most, we've had you on you're the most repeat guest that we've ever had on the show. So I'm excited to welcome you back.
Well, you make it fun, Anthony, and you've got an interesting group of listeners who I like speaking to.
Well, one of the reasons is, when in your position that you were before you retired, you really covered a wide range of cropping systems here in the West and a number of the bees that visited them. And we thought we'd been having a conversation back and forth since the last episode we recorded about really doing something around raspberries and caneberries. Because here in Oregon, we're, and right through the Pacific Northwest, it's a really important crop. And one that maybe, is not so straightforward in terms of, its pollination needs.
Yeah, they are more forgiving than some other crops. They're certainly more forgiving than almonds, where you have self-incompatibility that requires pollen to flow from varieties in one row to another row. And so bees that stay in the same tree don't do anything for pollination. With raspberries and blackberries are largely self-compatible. There's some work out of Poland that suggests that there can be gains in fruit set or size with cross-pollination. That's manual pollination, so it's not a lot of flowers involved, but there might be. But you can get very satisfactory crops in solid blocks of raspberry or blackberry, and that's a lot easier. So the other thing, my student, we can talk about that in a bit, but so they're fairly friendly crops for pollination, but they do benefit from pollination, particularly for commercial yields.
Now, when we think about raspberries, we think about that there's a broader group. They're very related crops in the caneberries. Here in Oregon, we're so proud of marionberries, but we also have blackberries. So there's a related suite. But then there's, in that same group in the rose family, we've got things like strawberries, and then we have some wild plants that are in the, closely related to raspberry. So just what are we eating? When we get a raspberry, what exactly is, what is it?
Yeah, well, and there is one other crop there, which I've not worked with much, but black raspberry, which mostly goes to processing, but makes some phenomenal flavors in other foods. But a raspberry is an unusual fruit, relatively unusual fruit, It's multi-seeded, as you know. Same thing with a blackberry. All those little seeds you get from one berry. But the flower is arranged such that you have the ring of petals, and inside of that is the ring of anthers that yield the pollen that's needed for cross-pollination. And inside of that is a fountain of pistils, each pistil leading to one ovule that will produce one seed if it's pollinated. And each pistil is topped by a stigma that's the receptive surface to which pollen must arrive. Raspberries are self-fertile, and the outer pistils, just by being knocked about by a breeze or the like, touch the ring of anthers and pick up pollen. So it's rare that you don't get any fruit at all without pollination. But each of those little ovules, when it matures a seed, a little bit of flesh forms around it. That's that little red balloon that when they're all bunched together with a well-pollinated fruit, the fruit slips off the receptacle very easily. And that's what you want. And the need for a pollinator is that the central pistils in that fountain of pistils just physically can't reach the surrounding anthers. And so that's where a bee comes in. If you don't have a bee, you end up with a tuft of brown tissue at the apex of the fruit. Or you'll end up with just a scattering of the drupelets, those little red balloons. And in both those cases, the fruit won't let go of the receptacle. With your fingers, it'll just squish in your fingers. So it can't be harvested. And, of course, it's not sized up very well either. So a well-pollinated fruit has lots of those little drupelets, the little red balloons that all squeeze against each other like a big bunch of balloons at a carnival, and makes them lift off the receptacle. So that's why you need bees, is for those terminal pistils in the fountain of pistils on a given flower.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense, and I've experienced this before as well. They're just sometimes with salmon berries, the same thing. You when you've got a really well pollinated salmon berry, it just kind of like you touch it and the whole fruit lifts off the receptacle. It's so easy.
Yeah, and actually, you can, while you're picking and eating fruits at that time of year, you can have some evaluation of, oh boy, it was very well pollinated, or there's a pollination shortfall here. It's a nice little indicator for that. Yep.
Okay, so the bees, I imagine one of their jobs is one of the things that they do when they visit is that they're kind of walking around and kind of facilitating that transfer from those outer rim of stigmas to that sort of from the stamens to the central stigmas.
Exactly. And you'll notice when bees land on those flowers, whether it's a honeybee, a bumblebee, or even the small carpenter bees, especially honeybees or bumblebees, they land kaplop right in the middle of the flower. And they got pollen all over their body, so it doesn't take much. And slightly smaller bees will oftentimes, because we've worked with several Osmia species, and they will pirouette. They'll land on the center of the flower, and with their tongue out, the nectaries are down at the base, where the anthers and pistils meet.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So they've got to go through.
And you can actually see it in sunlight with a hand lens for a flower that's not been visited. You can see a little glistening lake of nectar there. It's a bounteous amount. So the bee will stand on the top of that column of pistils and rotate about with its tongue out, probing for nectar as it goes around.
Because
so it can't.
The nectaries aren't on the outside; they're in between.
Right.
Oh, so they were kind of sitting in and so they're. If it was an osmia, then its scopa is just kind of traveling over.
Yes,
all
exactly. The scope is just with the dry pollen, and the scope is just dragging all over those pistils. Even little Serotina in a big blackberry flower. When I've watched them, I've not quantified this, but when I've watched them, a lot of times they'll work around the ring of anthers. But at some point, they walk up and over the top of the pistils on just about every flower visit. So I suspect they're even good pollinators. And in something like black raspberry, where the growers leave the dead canes to accumulate, they also accumulate nesting by small carpenter bees in those dead canes. And they may be contributing a considerable amount to black raspberry pollination.
That's right, because the small carpenter bee, unlike some of our mason bees, they like a pithy stem, so they'll be digging it out, and that's like a prime habitat for them.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
They can definitely multiply in any of the cane fruits that way if there's dead canes that are broken off.
Okay, and so even a small bee like that, just by kind of physically working around, and does it require a lot of pollen to be able to set one of these pistils?
There's just one ovule per pistil. So, I mean, technically it should only be 1 or 2 pollen grains for that. And some of our biggest raspberry fruits might have had 80 or 90 drupelets. So it's not, and the outer ones, of course, are set just passively. So it's not very demanding. It's much friendlier than, say, squash, where you actually need a lot of multiple visits in order to pollinate all those ovules.
Now, I remember talking to beekeepers. They really like going into raspberry because unlike some of the other spring crops in the Pacific Northwest, there is a lot of nectar. Is that true?
Yes. Ton of nectar in raspberry flowers, and the pollen's easily accessible for any visiting bee. And raspberry pollen has a good protein content, so it's quite nutritious. You'll notice when you watch bumblebees or honeybees, where it's more easily visible, working in those crops, every one of them's got a pollen load. And the pollen from those crops is a kind, well, depends on the variety, but it tends to be a cream trending toward gray. And you can see they're all loaded up with pollen. I've watched with one big commercial raspberry grower west of Portland. His neighbor had a big crimson clover crop that he was trying to produce seed on. And on the far side of that, he had an apiary. And the bees from that apiary were blithely flying over the crimson clover crop to get to the raspberries.
Really?
So it's very popular with honeybees and other bees too.
Crimson clover not being unattractive. So that really speaks to the attractiveness of the raspberries.
Right. It was like, what would it be like? Well, I suppose one example might be something like, I don't know. Think of your favorite dessert versus an okay dessert and reaching for the favorite dessert. It was like that. Oh. So a beekeeper can really prosper with raspberry. That's no problem at all. They make a lot of money on raspberry.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break. I want to come back. You have done, with a student, have done some research on different bee species. And so let's come back after the break and let's talk about that research and maybe some practical tips for some of our commercial raspberry growers on how to really manage their crop for pollinators.
Yeah, sounds good, Anton.
We're back. So now honeybees love, as you mentioned before the break, really love raspberries. But I imagine being an open flower with a lot of nectar, accessible pollen, that must attract a number of other bee species. What other bees might people see on the raspberries?
I'd say the most dependable would be many of your species of bumblebees that occur in Western Oregon. I've seen and counted at raspberry flowers and blackberry flowers, especially raspberry. They'll probably be the most noticeable bee going up and down the rows, and you'll see multiple species there on any given farm, especially farms that are surrounded by kind of woodsy abandoned land as opposed to row crop agriculture. Mm-hmm. There's also quite a suite of sweat bees, especially halictus, that are visiting the flowers. There's also quite a list of andrena species. And then the little small carpenter bees, who are quite tiny bees. They're dwarfed on especially blackberry flowers, but they can be especially abundant because they like to nest in broken dead canes. They like to excavate the pith and make a nest. And so especially if a grower has black raspberries, in which the practice is to leave the dead canes to accumulate, those bees multiply like crazy. in my own raspberries here at home and blackberries, I intentionally leave the dead canes cut off maybe 10 inches long in the garden, and every one of them's got a serotina hole in it. So it's quite a range of bees.
Okay.
On commercial acreage, outside of the bumblebees and maybe the sweat bees, you can find all these other bees, but they're not in great abundance. Partly because of the shifting agriculture, I suppose, partly because maybe nesting sites are disrupted fairly frequently because the growers rotate in and out of given blocks of raspberries, every handful of years, and then they go to a grass crop for a year, and then they come back with more raspberries. And so it may be challenging for native bees to track that in abundance.
So I imagine in situations like that, it might make sense to this was a big focus of a lot of research at the Bee Lab in Logan, looking for some managed species, some species that might be able to supplement some of these wild species that might not be, when you get to larger agricultural settings, you'd be able to supplement. And it sounds like you've done some work with this. Tell us a little bit about the research and some of the species you were looking at.
The bee that I focused on over there, and it was serendipitous that I came up with them, was Osmia aglaya, which is one of the brilliant green osmia that occurs west of the Cascade and Sierra Crest, all the way down to at least Los Angeles and up into Western Oregon. And I originally got a starting population from Ron Vanderhellen, who lives down in Central Point. He was getting them in his alfalfa leaf-cutting bee boards. He puts out wooden boards, or did, when he was working. And he was getting a lot of these, and rather than just, of course, to use commercial punching equipment, would have just squished them, the nests.
It's a pulp nest, eh?
It's a leaf pulp partition nest without a leaf pack wall, so it doesn't push out. Okay. But he worked around those and then reared them out, and then put in touch with Karen Strickler, who put in touch with me, wondering what this bee was. And it turned out to be Osmia aglaya. And it's very friendly to multiply. I was flying as many as 20,000 females in red raspberry and blackberry over there in Western Oregon. And not easy to do because I have to fly out with the partly incubated bees and then rent a car and have shelters stored at one of the growers that I would then disperse in the fields. And of course, weather wasn't always good. And yet still, I could make increases with the bee, with the system I was using. But ultimately, I don't think it's, at least from a distance, it's not practical. The biggest problem actually was the paper straw liners for the styrofoam nesting blocks. It'll use nest holes the size that alfalfa leaf cutting bees will use. So you can use leaf cutting bee equipment. Yeah. But it won't tolerate the bare styrofoam walls like a leaf cutting bee will. So you have to use a paper straw liner. And that was actually cost prohibitive relative to honeybees, because honeybees are so cheap per forager. So for smaller growers, it might be practical, but for larger growers, I'd say not. The other bee, which turned out to be all these bees, honeybees, bumblebees, Osmia aglaya, also blue orchard bee, Osmia ligneri, they're all equivalently good pollinators. And we can talk about that in a second. This work from my student, Corey Andrikopoulos. But they're all equally good pollinators. Blue orchard bees, if you winter them at freezing or a little bit below freezing, you can hold them till raspberry bloom, and they perform superbly. No mortality, no shortened lifespan, and they are thrilled to use raspberries for provisioning their nests, and their larvae perform admirably.
But the problem is that this is we would have naturally they'd emerge a month or a month and a half earlier.
If you overwinter them at, say, 40 degrees Fahrenheit in a refrigerator, they start burning through fat body way too early. And I've had them starve trying to hold them till June. But if you winter them, modify a freezer and hold it just below freezing, you can hold them into June and July. This is Corey's work. And they do superbly. So it's a way, another crop on which you could use them, or a crop on which you could multiply them, or if you have a surplus of them, hold some back in that way. You'll have to know it back in the wintertime, but you can hold them back and fly them on raspberries. You can also, wintering them like that, you can bring them out for apple bloom and they'll do fine for that too. It's just a little harder to arrange to have a freezer temperature of 28 Fahrenheit. But it works well.
Okay, so Osmia glea worked well, Osmia lignaria worked well, and you said the bumblebees also.
Yes, also good pollinators, and those are the ones that growers are more likely to have. Some growers have in fair abundance in their raspberries and blackberries. It depends on what the surrounding land is like, because of course most of those species need a rodent burrow and rodent nest in which to build their nest, and they need forage for the rest of the year, not just during raspberry and blackberry bloom, in terms of what their colony needs. So if you have some wildland around your farm, there's a good chance you'll probably have more bumblebees than if your farm is in the midst of row crop agriculture, in which case you may not have that many bumblebees.
Although I have to say, I remember Dr. Rao would point out, and Dr. Stevens as well, that there was a way in which here in Western Oregon, you may have a white clover field come on, just, there's still enough heterogeneity in the cropping systems here. And we still have, a number of crops that bumblebees will go to, although, with the expansion of things like hazelnut and wine grapes, that's diminishing. But there used to be a period where you would have blueberries and then raspberries and then clover and radish seed.
And I think that Western Oregon is probably more promising for that than any other agricultural region I've seen. Because the queens can start on blueberries and give them a really good start for a nest. And then, like you say, they follow from one crop to the other, and they can fly a long distance, easily a mile to forage. So you could have the mix of flowering crops conveniently nearby for bumblebees, and they then pollinate each of those crops in turn.
Well,
it can be a pretty nice deal.
Let's circle back to bumblebees in a second, but I guess the burning question I have is you looked at these different, you and Corey looked at these different species, and you talked about, there's one ovule at the bottom of this pistil, and you always hear about bees and their efficiency, like, Osmia lignaria, it's worth, a million honeybees or something. Did you see any differences between the visitations and, getting a full?
Nope. They're all equivalent. We looked at 3 different varieties. We used Cowichan. We used Latham. We used one other, and then because it was convenient to grow, we used Royalty, which is a purple raspberry that's not of great commercial value. But for that, the bees are all pretty much interchangeable, and they were the equivalent of our Corey's hand pollinations, in which he really rubbed in a lot of pollen onto the pistils. In some cases, the bees are better than our hand pollinations, but not significantly so. But they're all interchangeable. And that was both in greenhouse and in a very large field cage setting where we could control visitation and confine the bees. But the field cage is huge, over planted rows of raspberries that are drip irrigated.
Wow. Okay, well, that's good to know. So I guess the one message is that perhaps if you're a raspberry grower and you have honeybees, you'll be okay. But I guess this comes around to bumblebees, because we were talking at the break about how bumblebees, fit into maybe a honeybee in Western Oregon to a crop that honeybees pollinate. We've got a number of them where bumblebees show up. We have clover seed, we have blueberry, raspberry. What's the advantage of maybe keeping an eye on retaining bumblebees in those systems, even though honeybees seem to be sufficient?
The big one is that, and I've seen it, I guess it's just burned into my memory, there were days with blackberries in which there were your classic weather there where you have a half-hour window of time in which it stops raining, the sun breaks through the clouds, the bumblebees come awake, start flying around and foraging, and the clouds come back in. And I never did see honeybees on days like that. So in years with poor weather during bloom, bumblebees are going to do a lot of pollination for the grower. And I even know of one grower whose beekeeper had passed away, And so and this is a big commercial grower, and he was lacking any honeybees on his farm. And he had a normal crop, but he was also the grower that had the most bumblebees of any grower I had seen. He had a lot of wildland around his farm. For a rule of thumb, and it took some doing to calculate this, and Bernadine Strick helped me with some of the average fruit yields per acre there in Western Oregon. But with raspberries, calculating backwards, figuring 90% fruit set, taking the average weight of a fruit, taking her figures where there might be about 2 million, or 8,000, 9,000 pounds per acre of fruit, divide that by the weight of the average fruit, I get back to something in the neighborhood of 20 million flowers per acre in raspberries. And from that, and knowing pollination efficiencies, and floral visitation rates, I calculate that a grower, if they see about one bee, honeybee or these other bees, at one bee per 9 feet of row, they've got adequate pollination. They could probably have 2 or 3 times that. So one bee per 3 feet of row as they walk their rows. And that's probably not too much. But if they start to exceed that, they're going to be shorting their bumblebees on pollen and nectar. It's going to be too much competition for those 2 floral resources. And so bumblebees won't produce as many reproductives, and there won't be as many colonies the next year. So that's a ballpark number to shoot for. And the reason I calculated this is we saw some farms that were just awash in honeybees, a couple honeybees per foot of row. Mm-hmm. And that's way too many honeybees. If you're paying money for that, you don't need to be doing it as a grower. You can have far fewer than that. Like I say, something in the neighborhood of 5, maybe 10, one bee for every 5 or 10 feet of row. A bumblebee or a honeybee or a sweat bee is quite satisfactory. And stocking for red raspberry.
And I suppose you're going to get adequate pollination there, and then the potential side benefit is that it'll allow the bumblebee populations to kind of reach the carrying capacity of that landscape, so that you may have some backup if something goes wrong.
Yeah. No, and if there isn't many nesting opportunities, there aren't rodent burrows around for those, most of which nest underground, not all of them. But that may be the limiting resource rather than floral resources. But certainly that one grower, he had a lot of bumblebees in his farm. Though it doesn't look like that much. It doesn't need to be rollicking at all. It's not that many bees because the flowers hold for multiple days and remain receptive. And the bees are visiting pretty fast. And from Corey Androkopoulos' very fussy work with 1 and 2 visits with these bees, 1 visit satisfies almost all of your fruit pollination needs, and 2 visits guarantees it. So it's mostly the proportion of runty fruits, and you'll have a almost non-existent proportion of runt fruits with 2 visits by any of those bee species. So it's not that much. So it's not that many bees given the duration of the foraging day and that the flowers hold for multiple days.
Well, that's great. We've got a good rule of thumb there for, going through your rows, looking at your bee densities, maybe adjusting in the next year. Maybe you're getting way too many and you're like, you can bring them down and then get to a nice equilibrium. And I suppose the next thing is there any other considerations, for caneberry growers who want to, really kind of build up the health of their pollinators around their fields?
Yeah. A prime one, I would say, especially at the time, this was before spotted wing Drosophila made it to Oregon. And so I was very impressed. I was being asked by a group to learn about pesticide practices, especially insecticide practices. And most growers are using one spray of a pyrethroid for the whole growing season in their raspberries or blackberries. That was it. Very clean crop in terms of insecticide use. Those halcyon days are gone now because of spotted wing Drosophila. What I would warn growers about, certainly for insecticides, broad spectrum insecticides, obviously is don't spray when bees are active. during bloom, maybe you can have a cloudy day in which there's no bees, a cool cloudy day that might be okay. But if you have bloom, try not to spray broad spectrum insecticides. If it's a short-lived insecticide, something that's only active for a couple hours, spray toward dusk. And if you're using fungicides, I've seen a grower in which their workers were spraying fungicide at noon on a sunny day in which bees were active in the block in which they were spraying. The problem with some of the fungicides is that the spreading agents are not good for bees. So if you, again, for fungicides, which I know they need to spray during bloom oftentimes, spray it toward dusk. And that way it can dry onto the flowers, won't hit any bees, and it can dry on the flowers before the next day comes around. And that should help if they need to spray during bloom, which I think they do.
Yeah, it seems like there are a lot of blossom rots. I mean, it seems the issue with fungicides and bees has, in some of these spring crops, things like botrytis, you can have a fruit just turn into a massive mycelia if you're not careful.
Yeah. Same with cranberries. I know. I don't know about your cranberries, but from a colleague, Dan Schiffauer in New Jersey, that was a big issue with cranberries in a patchy way inside the cranberry beds.
But it's a great advice, though. I think I've seen California Almond Board make this recommendation as well as fungicides in the evening. Let those residues dry up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they've got the money and the wherewithal to really give that close attention, and so that's good advice from them. And it's another, as we open, that's another rosaceous crop. The same sort of thing. It's a very open flower. It's not like a blueberry.
Well, fantastic, Jim. I think this gives us a good primer. I'm sure people are, when this episode airs, I think we're going to start to see some of the first bloom on a raspberry out here. So excellent, timely advice from you, Jim.
And one of these days I will create a fact sheet for extension there in Oregon. I just haven't gotten around to it, but I've got the graphics for it sitting in front of me right here. I just haven't gotten around to writing one.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Well, Jim, we always appreciate how productive you are in seeming retirement. I said that in scare quotes.
Yeah, it scares me at times. I get caught up in too much writing. That's the least favorite part of it, but that's the conclusion to any research like I do.
Well, we look forward to seeing you out here in Oregon after all this pandemic stuff clears. We always enjoy having you out here.
Yep, I enjoy being out there, Anthony. You've got a great bunch of folks, including yourself.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan-Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.